Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to acknowledge the outstanding academic institutions that have come together in this very important conference. I particularly want to recognize the organizer, Lema Senbet. Lema, thank you, and Matt Richardson, Chester Spratt, Nancy Wallace, and the organizations, the institutions of higher education that you represent. I also want to recognize your two other keynote speakers, Rob Engel, our Nobel laureate, Rob, and also Andy Lo. Both Rob and Andy have been very helpful to me and to my colleagues in many of the issues that impacted the Office of Financial Research, so thank you very, very much. This July, we recognized the one-year anniversary of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. And all of our financial regulators, including many of you who are in attendance here today, are currently engaged in implementing the most comprehensive financial legislation since the 1930s. Our regulators are doing this with deliberation and determination, and are doing so in the face of numerous challenges, not the least being the current crisis in the Eurozone that seems eerily familiar to what we experienced in 2008 and 2009. As I looked at the papers today, I was struck by their timeliness, financial sector linkages, and the dynamics of bank and sovereign credit spreads, evaluating the government as a source of systemic risk, and money fund runs seem especially provocative and timely, and I look forward to reading them. I will confess, however, that I will merely scan any generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity models. This might be the only crowd in America that would laugh at a line like that. So just think about that for a moment, ladies and gentlemen. As everyone in this room recognizes, that the failure to effectively regulate our financial sector has caused and continues to cause tremendous costs throughout our economy and throughout the world economy. Our unemployment rate rose from 4.7% in November of 2007 to 10.1% in October of 2009. A loss of about 8.5 million jobs, and we are still reeling from those job losses. We saw a $17 trillion decrease in household wealth because of the financial crisis in the United States. Communities have lost tax revenues, are struggling just to keep the lights on, literally, at many public facilities. So today, when there are complaints about the cost of implementing Dodd-Frank, I think they have to be weighed against these staggering costs. And these costs are still reverberating throughout our country. We have an obligation to create an efficient regulatory structure that balances cost of regulations with effective regulatory outcomes. But we would be very forgetful indeed if we embraced the widely held notion before the crisis, probably most especially expressed by Chairman Greenspan, that, quote, in his words, risk in financial markets, including derivatives markets, are being regulated by private parties. Too often, some critics attempt to dismantle and underfund our regulators and implicitly return to the market knows best approach. I don't think that will work. We cannot forget the chaotic events of the financial crisis that revealed serious flaws in our financial structure and led to the passage of Dodd-Frank. And we have to make sure that Dodd-Frank is indeed effectively implemented. If we look back, we know now in 2020 hindsight that some financial institutions were not only too big to fail, they were interconnected in ways not obvious to regulators and investors. Too many lacked adequate capital and were over-leveraged. These large institutions were so complex that even their own management was unaware of the risks that they were taking on. Thus, they were opaque to regulators, the marketplace, indeed their own management. Unregulated derivatives and off-balance sheet arrangements heightened the complexity and uncertainty of the financial markets. And despite claims, again, Chairman Greenspan being in the vanguard, in his words, that derivatives were an extraordinary useful vehicle to transfer risk from those who shouldn't be taking it to those who are willing to and are capable of doing so, too often derivatives didn't aid commerce, but instead concentrated and multiplied risk. In the face of these staggering financial challenges, the government had a poor understanding of the systemic risk and inadequate tools to deal with the burgeoning crisis. The crisis also revealed a large shadow banking system of unregulated or underregulated mortgage companies, finance companies, and derivatives dealers, and other entities. Many of these entities were directly competing with banks that were subject to prudent rules and rigorous regulatory oversight. In addition, regulatory arbitrage was practiced within and between national and international regulators, resulting at times in a race to the bottom that just increased risk. And quasi-public regulatory arrangements, especially credit rating agencies, performed poorly. In the wake of these cross-cutting problems, Dodd-Frank addressed a significant range of issues, but to my mind, the most important include, first, increasing transparency and reducing opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. Second, focusing on systemic risk and not just individual institutional behavior. Third, giving the regulator the ability to increase capital and specify its form, to reduce leverage, and to minimize speculative trading. Fourth, to attempt to regulate the over-the-counter derivative market. And finally, to create a new resolution regime for too-big-to-fail institutions. There are other aspects of the law, but these, to me, are some of its major provisions, and let me comment on just a few of these topics. One of the most important steps that we took in the area of increasing transparency has to do with derivatives. Dodd-Frank closed a huge regulatory loophole by defining swaps for the first time and requiring their regulation. The goal was to move as many swaps as possible to being opaque bilateral transactions onto clearinghouses, exchanges, and trading platforms, where risk was known and shared. These changes and others should shine more light on the derivatives markets, improving pricing, efficiency, and transparency. Even bankers acknowledge the shortcomings in the derivatives marketplace. In a recent speech, Citigroup CEO Vikram Pandit noted derivatives remain too opaque. He also added that lack of transparency inhibits market discipline, obscures risk, and leaves nasty surprises buried in the system. If derivative reforms are properly implemented through regulation, some believe that interest rate and credit default swaps could grow, increasing financial activity in this area. In effect, a well-regulated marketplace could attract business from around the world. The CEO of Tradeweb, Lee Olesky, recently stated that regulation is accelerating the transition of derivatives trading to more efficient markets. Another key step we took to make our financial system more transparent was the creation of the Office of Financial Research. As we learned, one of the factors contributing to the financial collapse was the lack of good data systems that gave firms and regulators a real-time understanding of the risks on their balance sheets. Moreover, OFR will enable for the first time an adequate assessment of systemic aspects, including any mismatch of short-term funds and long-term obligations across firms, not simply within a firm, and the co-movement of a firm's assets with the aggregate financial sector. I also believe that the standardization of data that OFR is creating will lead to a substantial improvement in data systems and should reduce operating costs of individual firms and make the financial health of the firms clearer to the regulators. And additionally, the creation of an apolitical and cutting-edge analytical group within the government should help anticipate problems on the horizon and assist regulators and industry in better dealing with these problems when they occur. Some have suggested that OFR is unnecessary, but I think you just look around and show that we're still in a great deal of uncertainty about the world economy. If we look to Europe, we see that the lack of disclosure and transparency regarding liquidity gives rise to a lack of confidence and trust. Some credit default swaps are not transparently traded. There's been great speculation about how much exposure American banks, money market funds, and other financial firms have not only to Greece, but to Italy, Portugal, Spain, France, and the rest of Europe. There is a huge range of estimates about how much CDS is outstanding on Greek debt, let alone other members of the Eurozone. And because credit default swaps were mainly traded over the counter, there's no sure way of finding out. We hope going forward that the data and the analysis that the OFR will be able to provide to regulators will be able to shine some light on not just this area of derivatives, but many other difficult and complicated issues, and that we will be making decisions based upon analysis and data, not on gut instincts. One thing we have to do is nominate and confirm as quickly as possible, a director of OFR. The administration has to send the name up, and then we have to get about the business, which used to be somewhat routine around here, of confirming the president's nominees and getting a person to run the organization. Because we have to send the signal that OFR is here for real and forever, and that they will be a partner and participant in some of this activity that you are doing on your own. That, I think, is going to be very, very important to do. Another aspect, as I suggested with respect to Dodd-Frank, was the attempt to reduce regulatory arbitrage. As everyone is aware, we abolished OTS and redistributed its powers to the Federal Reserve, the OCC, and the FDIC. We also, in another attempt to bring agencies together, required joint rulemakings between financial regulatory agencies on critical issues, such as between the SEC and the CFTC on defining a mixed swap. In fact, the participation of SEC and CFTC on some of these efforts is commendable. It's difficult, because they have a difficult set of challenges, but very commendable, and I commend both Chairman Shapiro and Chairman Gensler for their work to try to harmonize the process. One of the key challenges we have moving forward is, in addition to harmonizing what we do within the United States, is to ensure that we work constructively with our counterparts in Europe and Asia to decrease regulatory arbitrage. This is a growing problem. I don't have to tell anybody in this audience. We've seen the European Union moving slowly and surely forward on its own financial regulatory reform, but we have to guard against the possibility or the deliberate creation of opportunities for regulatory arbitrage across international lines. Finally, one of the things the Dodd-Frank Bureau did was create the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. The CFPB is responsible for streamlining and simplifying consumer protection laws. Before it was created, 17 separate federal agencies had consumer protection statutes to enforce. Now all the rules will be in one place. Banks, as you know, under $10 billion will remain under the supervision of their regulators, but all large financial firms will be supervised directly by the CFPB. And one of the things that's most critical in this arrangement is that the CFPB will be ensuring that these laws are applied to all financial firms selling a certain product. That means that mortgage lenders, payday lenders, private student loan lenders, and others will be subject to the same regulations that apply to regulated institutions. So it's an attempt to move the shadow banking system out from the shadows. We have to do this, and I think it will provide better knowledge to consumers and better competitive opportunities for all of these financial institutions. But once again, we're seeing the regulatory process be upset by the legislative process as some of my colleagues continue to filibuster the nominee for the CFPB. Once again, I think that individual should be confirmed quickly so it can get on to business. One of the ironies here is that as the longer we delay in creating and effectively standing up the CFPB, the more that the shadow banking system will operate without any controls, and the playing field will be uneven, not even as it should be. Another accomplishment of Dodd-Frank was the creation of the Financial Stability Oversight Council. We all know this is still a work in progress, but it does create for the first time a forum so that all of our regulators can share knowledge, insights about what is happening, and also concentrate on a view beyond their narrow focus of operational responsibilities to the broader economy, not just within the United States, but worldwide. FSOC is designed also to serve as an early warning system to identify those problems that are rising up, and also to be a source of advice not only to the Congress but the administration about how we cope with emerging problems throughout the world. These attempts and provisions are meant to reduce some of the risk of we've seen in the last several years. And it's also, I think, something that's required so that we have a much more effective and more efficient market, not just here in the United States, but across the globe. The other aspect of Dodd-Frank, and I want to emphasize, is the requirement to impose safer capital requirements on U.S. financial institutions. As we learned for the financial crisis, There were many smaller regional banks that were able to weather the storm because they were well capitalized, because they had diversified loan portfolios and lower leverage. These institutions indeed continue to be sources of strength to the economy, lending to consumers throughout the country. Dodd-Frank requires the Federal Reserve to establish enhanced risk-based capital and liquidity requirements. This is extremely important because it would reduce leverage. As you know, this is part of an effort around the world to improve both the level and form of capital to strengthen the fabric of our global financial system and reduce opportunities for regulatory arbitrage. Capital standards and reduced leverage are one side of the coin. The other side is the Volcker Rule, which allows regulators to largely separate proprietary trading from lending activities and thus can help control the use of insured deposits for risky investments. The Volcker Rule allows regulators to require additional capital to protect the safety and soundness of any banking entities engaged in permitted proprietary trading or permitted sponsoring or investing in private funds. To ensure the firms are not taking on unnecessary risks or evading the Volcker Rule, the law limits any investments to 3% of the Tier 1 capital of the bank and 3% of the overall investment in any private fund. And a provision that I authored requires that the capital charge for any of these private fund investments be at least 100%, and the amount of capital they must be retained increases with the leverage of the hedge fund or the private equity fund. As the recent trading scandal in Switzerland demonstrates, the idea that financial institutions should curb or more appropriately regulate proprietary trading is taking on increased momentum, and it should. We have done, I think, a great deal with Dodd-Frank in putting in a framework, but no law is perfect. And let me, in hindsight, suggest several of what I think are continuing issues that we have to deal with. First, and this is, I think, a shortcoming that was a process of the legislative process, is that we were not able to give the SEC and the CFTC adequate and stable source of funding. And we've seen the repercussions. In July, the House Appropriations Committee cut the Securities and Exchange Commission's budget under the supposed rationale of reducing the federal deficit. But as we recognize, the SEC fees are not paid by the government, they're paid by market participants, and indeed not a dime of taxpayer money goes directly through the SEC. And market participants know they have to have a well-funded SEC. In September, the Senate Appropriations Committee voted for the President's appropriation of $1.407 billion. It is this full amount that we need. It's critical that the SEC and CFTC have the resources to do the jobs, in fact, the more difficult jobs they've been given. Second, we wrote Dodd-Frank assuming that our financial service regulators would have the knowledge, the resources, and the staff they need, in effect, the institutional capacity to implement rules and regulations, some of which require very sophisticated judgments. Clearly, if the Federal Reserve and other regulators do not have the capacity or the tools, then we have to resort, I think, they have to resort to a much blunter instrument, and that's capital. We learned during the crisis that common equity was superior to all other capital instruments, and it's also a reasonable proxy for internalization of systemic risk by financial firms. And so, indeed, one of the choices that we have to make is if we cannot successfully implement these new, very complicated rules, again, once again, that capital seems to be the last remedy in order to ensure appropriate avoidance of future crises. There are some, though, that believe these capital requirements will mean less economic growth because of constraints on lending. There is academic research that suggests that increased capital will have only a modest effect. But that's one of the issues I think you will consider as you go forward in your deliberations. We are at a point where we have to move forward with the regulatory process. We're looking at our colleagues across the globe. The British government is proposing even more stringent, in some respects, rules and regulations. So I think it's incumbent upon us to get to work to get Dodd-Frank not just on the legislative books, but in the regulations. There's a third, I think, aspect of the legislative process that looking at caused some chagrin in my respects, and that is the nature of the liquor case process is compartmentalized. And as a result of this, and a result of our focus on the structure of financial regulation, we didn't consider in full tax issues, accounting issues, bankruptcy laws, other factors that are absolutely critical to provide the incentives or disincentives for appropriate behavior. They weren't examined by the relevant committees, nor were the relevant committees charged to produce legislation. And so as a result, there is some unfinished work to be done. And again, I hope this conference points out the way with respect to bankruptcy treatment of derivatives, repo agreements, the need for additional complementary legislation. I think that would be a huge and positive service that you could render to us. Now, the final point I'll make is that, and I've suggested this in several previous comments, our confirmation process is not working as it should work. It's incumbent upon the administration to send the names up, then it's incumbent upon us to carefully review but approve qualified nominees. And when a Nobel laureate cannot serve on the board of the Federal Reserve because he lacks sufficient macroeconomic skills, I begin to wonder whether that might be not a reason but an excuse. We have to get on with the appropriations process, the confirmation process. Just let me conclude by quoting someone very wise who years ago, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, said, "A page of history is worth a volume of logic." We cannot afford to forget the crisis of 2008, the painful attempts in 2009 to rectify our economy, and the continuing economic damage that this crisis has done. And that one page of history, I think, should compel us to even more concerted, more deliberate, more timely action to regulate our financial system. Thank you for what you're doing, because it is making a huge contribution to our efforts. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir. No, go ahead. No.
Okay, good. Thanks, sorry.
No, it's quite all right.
Pete Axelrod from DTCC. I wanted to ask you about the international coordination aspects of this, not just regulatory arbitrage, but access to data and data sharing and those sorts of things, because there's so much offshore trading around the world on underlyings that affect onshore concerns.
Right. No, this goes to the larger question of wouldn't it have been better to reach sort of an understanding internationally and then working on this as the problem, I think the reality was we'd still be working on even a limited response legislatively if we were waiting for agreement with the G20 and everyone else. I think one of the decisions that was made was we will try to lead by example, which is to go ahead and first pass Dodd-Frank, then aggressively, and when the process to implement the legislation. And the core of it goes to this notion of OFR's responsibility, in my view, of setting up better data systems here that I would hope would serve as the models, maybe because they're the first ones out of the box, but as the models for the kind of systems that we could request or suggest or negotiate with our international colleagues so that we have a consistent set of information. But this issue of data, not just national data, but international data, is going to be more and more pressing on us because, as you point out, this is a global economy. People like, to a degree, some people like opaque areas where they can operate in the shadows. One of the thrusts of Dodd-Frank and one of the thrusts of regulation, both national and international, is to make sure the data is available, make sure it's clear, and it's consistent. Again, with respect to derivatives, the hope is if we move more onto clearing platforms, more onto trading venues, that data will be obvious. But this is going to be one of the constant efforts, and I can only say, you know, what we hope we can accomplish is if we set up a model that appears to be working efficiently, effectively, that starts attracting capital into our markets because of the appeal of knowledge and information and clarity, then the rest of the world will follow. I think if we were still trying to figure it out, if we were still trying to, you know, get the legislation through, we wouldn't have the opportunity to at least provide an example and some leadership. Yes, sir.
Alan King from IBM. Excuse me, Alan King from IBM. I was wondering, in your position, have you sensed that there is a private sector interest in setting up these kinds of data sharing and especially information about liquidity, as you say, to reduce the uncertainty and the lack of trust that can build up in these markets when people don't have enough information to trade? Certainly among some of the customers that we have met, being on the front lines of some of these almost interminable and repeated crises, I think they are sensing a need for something that maybe even goes beyond OFR, but allows them to somehow gain some headlights into what's going on.
Then I start off with a simple-minded view of the market, and one of the basic principles of any competitive market is perfect information. You never get it, but the better information you have, the better market you have. Consumers can make wiser choices. Companies can make wiser investments. And one of the things we discovered in the crisis is these opaque markets cause consumers to make very bad choices, investors to make very bad choices. Some people profited, but the society and the economy overall and worldwide suffered dramatically. So this emphasis on better information is central, I think, to the functioning of markets. That is why I think, again, one of the prime responsibilities of OFR is to develop the data formats, simplify the information requests. One of the problems we have, and it's ironic, is sometimes too much information. Or the same information in 15 different formats by 15 different regulators. That's something that OFR has been told to see if they can sort of rationalize that. I think what is happening and what is impeding, though, a robust private sector engagement is, frankly, they're waiting to see what the rules of the game are. They're waiting to see what sort of standards are adopted by OFR for data, how are the markets reacting, and I think, again, that is an argument for not hasty but very speedy, deliberate, thorough, careful, but deliberate rulemaking and deployment of the OFR rules so that the private markets can react. My sense is that private entrepreneurs will move very quickly if they see the kind of the format and the standards in place, and that will supplement and complement. In fact, at some point, might even, be better and more revealing than some public data sources. Yes, sir, Rob.
Dodd-Frank mandated a pretty comprehensive switch of over-the-counter derivatives to central clearing. There's been a lot of movement away from the comprehensiveness of this, with various parties excluded from these requirements, various derivatives excluded from the requirements. Do you have a view on whether they're correcting something that you should have thought of, or whether they're really kind of dismantling the goal you had?
My sense at the moment is they are trying very much to put in place something that didn't exist before. First of all, defining what some of these products are, which is a challenge. I mean, they're starting from sort of from zero, if you will. This definitional process is challenging. Then I think there's they have to set up the clearing platforms, and we've required significant clearing efforts. And then they have the authority in the bill to force products that clearly are tradable onto trading platforms. It's not an option; they can direct that. So they're starting off with a sort of a clean slate, and they're encountering, I think, some very real problems of definition of what's the best approach. I think there's a lot of pushback, frankly, from the industry, saying, we like it this way, and I don't, that is, I think, expected. So I see them with a very difficult challenge. I don't see them, I see them trying to make improvements. I mean, frankly, one of the approaches that we decided on very deliberately is some of these issues are so novel, so complex, that a bunch of senators and representatives sitting on a table about 4 o'clock in the morning would not come up with the best solution. I mean, so naturally, I think that's where the regulatory process takes over. So I see this as progress, slow, but I think also, too, and in a way it's a reflection of my response to previous gentlemen, is that, once you break through and you've got, the standardized products, they're clearing regularly, and we begin to trade them regularly, that market will start expanding because of natural competitive natural attraction. It won't be because we're ordering people to do it. One of the other aspects, and this goes to kind of one of the criticisms of Dodd-Frank, there's 243 rules and regulations, et cetera. The presumption we had, and as I mentioned in my comments, was that the regulatory process would proceed in what we considered to be the traditional sense, thoughtful interchange with the public regulated actors as well as consumers and everybody else. The rules would be promulgated, et cetera. There'd be adequate resources to do that. And resources, not just money, but expertise, skill within the agencies, and support to do that. And as a result, I think that encouraged us. Now, if we find a year from now or months from now that those assumptions are not working out in practice, then we've got to go back to the drawing board and rethink some of the things we've done. There is a danger sometimes by specifying things in legislation, because it's awfully hard to change. One of the other advantages of a regulatory process is if they do something that's not, I dare to say, Pareto optimal, if that's the word, yeah. They have much more flexibility to come back and to make changes, where we would be, we saw this in so many different circumstances where we put in a statutory number, for example, and that number made sense in 1995. By 2005, it was actually dangerous and detrimental, not helpful.
Okay, one more question.
Well, thank you.